Hello everyone, and welcome to the 187th episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring Longlegs from the film Longlegs. At the time of this video's release, Longlegs has been out in theaters for a little over a week, and it's taken the internet by storm. But even before its release, it was making waves across the net, which can be attributed to a fantastic marketing campaign by Neon Studios that might just rival or surpass what I would consider the most successful marketing campaign for a horror film, that being what Hakeson Films accomplished with the Blair Witch Project back in the late 90s. Now, as far as the film itself goes, despite the stellar rating it has from critics on Rotten Tomatoes, I've seen a lot of mixed reviews from everyday viewers. Some people think it was fantastic, that it's one of the greatest horror films ever made, and that it lived up to and deserves all the praise it was given before its release. But there are many others who feel that the lagging third act, the use of flashbacks and voiceovers, and the plot's heavy reliance on the occult made what would have been an otherwise amazing film into a mediocrity. After I watched the film, I found myself somewhere in the middle, leaning more towards the opinion that it is indeed a great film, and if I had rated it when I came right out of the theater, I would have given it a 7 out of 10. However, the aforementioned marketing and the supplementary information that was included in that marketing may have just bumped this film up to a 9 for me, or maybe even a 10, and perhaps after watching this video, you just might feel the same way as well. Now, on the one hand, I get the argument that you shouldn't need to sift through mountains, and I do mean mountains, of supplementary information in order to fully understand a film, but on the other, damn does it make it all the more interesting when you learn about all the little details that went into making this film what it is. And when you factor in everything that you're about to learn about Longlegs, I'd even go as far as to state that this is one of the most, if not the most fantastic and intricate occult film ever released. So in order to clue you in on the many details surrounding this film, we're going to be going through a lot of information that can be found on the Birthday Murders website, excerpts from books, myths, films, music, and folklore that are referenced in materials we receive on the Birthday Murders website, in the film, and elsewhere, interviews with some of the people involved with the film, Instagram teasers, and of course, everything we're given about Longlegs and his crimes in the film itself. A lot of what we receive through this supplementary information and in the film, though, is quite cryptic, and because of that, I was definitely not able to discern every little detail on my own, so I've had to scour the internet for answers, with the people over on the Birthday Murders subreddit being particularly helpful. But aside from them, the most helpful resource I looked to when making this video was another video you can find here on YouTube by Mr. Hunteru, who made a gargantuan video delving into much of the marketing material prior to the film's release. So make sure to check out his channel, that video, as well as all of the sources I used when making this video down in the description. And when appropriate, I will be referencing the names of Reddit users in Mr. Hunteru, who I will refer to as Hunter going forward, when talking about any information that I discovered through them. Now without further ado, let's begin. One of the main questions this film leaves us with is who exactly is Longlegs, and why or how did he begin his dreaded work in the first place? Well, other than giving us his name, Dale Ferdinand Cobble, we don't really have a concrete answer to that question, but we do have a bevy of details that allow us to make some inferences about his character. One aspect of Longlegs that has caused a heavy amount of speculation is his appearance. In an interview with Rolling Stone, director Osgood Perkins had the following to say about Longlegs. It just ended up making sense that I would make Longlegs into this glam guy who had sort of had his life disrupted in the 70s, Perkins says. He just wanted to be a glam rock guy. He maybe plays a guitar kind of badly in his mom's basement. And one day, his life changed, and he had to go to work for the devil. Now, if this is what the director of the film envisioned for this character, then who am I to say that he's wrong? But because this film is so laden with details down to the minutia, I feel inclined to piece together what we're given to try and form a more concrete backstory for Longlegs. And there's a glaring issue with this potential origin story. According to the Birthday Murders website, Longlegs began murdering families in 1966, and the term glam rock wasn't coined until 1971 when the frontman of the band that's featured heavily in this story, Mark Bolan of T-Rex, appeared on the BBC music show Top of the Pops in March of 1971, wearing glitter and satins. From what we know, Longlegs' appearance hasn't changed at all since he started killing, so if he started in 1966, it would be impossible for him to be a former glam rocker considering glam rock didn't exist then. But do we really know that his appearance hasn't changed since 1966? There's only 2 times that Longlegs was ever seen by eyewitnesses, or captured on video at the scene of a crime, and that was in 1974 when he was spotted outside of the Ware family home, and in 1992 when he was captured on this video footage at the Horn family home. So it could be that Longlegs looked quite different in the early days of committing his crimes, and while he could have been an ardent fan of Mark Bolan since the beginning of his career in 1964 before he formed T-Rex, that still wouldn't explain how he could be a former glam rocker before glam rock even existed. However, even if he isn't a former glam rocker, that doesn't mean he wasn't a former would-be rock star who'd idolized and followed the career of Mark Bolan from the very beginning. Glam rock, Mark Bolan, and T-Rex were heavily influenced by psychedelic and art rock, and the band that Mark Bolan was briefly a part of in 1967, John's Children, has been described as being a precursor to glam rock. And while neither of those genres nor John's children featured people dressing in the flamboyant attire that we later come to associate with glam rock, many men of that era did wear their hair quite long, so Longlegs having long hair would be in line with the kind of hairstyle a psychedelic rocker might have worn. But even if he didn't wear his hair long then, it could still be the case that he was a would-be rocker who was an ardent fan of Mark Bolan, styling his appearance after the man every year since he began making music. And when Mark became a glam rocker in 1971, he chose to wear his hair long just like his idol. His obsession with Mark Bolan only became more solidified as his career progressed, for it was not just his appearance and the sound of his music that drew Longlegs to him, but his lyrics, as over the years Mark and T-Rex would release several songs with occult lyrics woven into them, with songs like Get It On, the most prominent of their songs featured in this film, featuring the lyric, "You've got the teeth of the Hydra upon you," which is a direct reference to a biblical passage denoting the emergence of the Antichrist, which we'll be talking about quite a bit later on. Now, all this speculation about his appearance and what he might have been might seem a tad pointless, but this allows us to make some assumptions about Longlegs' life that we can then craft into a fairly solid theorized backstory in place of an actual one. If we're going to take Osgood Perkins' description of Longlegs as a fact, that fact being that he was a guy trying his best to become a rock star whilst playing guitar badly in his mom's basement, let's say that Longlegs was born sometime in the 1940s, and for the sake of establishing a timeline, let's just say he was born in 1940, which would have made him a preteen or teenager in the early 1950s when rock and roll first started to pick up steam. After latching onto the rock and roll craze with intense fervor, Longlegs made it his goal to become a rock star himself. So over the next decade or so, he began to learn everything he could about rock and roll so he could make it big like his idols did. The only problem was that Longlegs had little to no talent for music, and so his singular pursuit of music ended in failure and residency in his mother's basement in his mid-20s, with no higher education, little to no job experience, and a heap of broken dreams. As far as his family life is concerned, perhaps his father enlisted into the military to fight in World War II a year after his son was born, and perished. And perhaps after his father died, his mother never remarried, and perhaps in 1965, his mother perished, leaving him alone in a world surrounded by his own mediocrity that drove him into a state of despondency. And it was through his despair that he found a religion to help him sort out his life, which is something that has helped many people get through tough times in their lives. But rather than finding comfort in the arms of Buddha or Christ, Longlegs found comfort in the occult and the devil. First, it was too many voices. They couldn't be understood. But then, they started to settle. These are the words in the description of the Dirty Part 2 trailer that can be found on the Neon Films YouTube channel, and we can only assume that after delving into the deepest mysteries of the occult, that those voices settled, so one might rise above them all to befriend our poor downtrodden would-be rock star, the man downstairs, Satan himself. And Longlegs' research into the occult, which is something we're going to discuss a lot in a moment, helped him greatly in reaching this communion with the devil, as there is an excerpt from a book that we're given in a file from the Birthday Murders website called Clairvoyance and Occult Powers by Swami Panchadasi or William Walker Atkinson that describes how the five senses can be harnessed to reach beyond the physical realm to commune with the spiritual plane, something that I'm sure Longlegs worked long and hard on to perfect. Now, I've done a whole lot of theorizing here, and while I've pulled a lot of these potential details out of my rear end, I think that no matter what the nitty-gritty of his story is, that this timeline for Longlegs seems pretty solid. But one thing about Longlegs' appearance that I haven't touched on yet is without a doubt the most jarring thing about him: his facial features, which give him the look of an old woman who's had one too many botched plastic surgeries. Well, to discern how Longlegs' face became this mess, we need to start looking at the details surrounding this story and his crimes, for that is surely where the devil lies. In order to do that though, we first need to briefly go over what Longlegs is doing in this film. Longlegs searches for families with daughters who have just turned or are about to turn 9 years old, whose birthdays land on the 14th of any given month. He then creates lifelike dolls made in the image of that daughter, that he crafts with dark magic, that he then has an accomplice take to the house of families, to possess them, and cause the father of these families to murder every member of their family before they take their own lives. An interesting fact about the use of these dolls can be found in the way that Longlegs often refers to cuckoos. And cuckoos are birds who move the eggs of other birds out of their nest, so these other birds will raise their children, much like Longlegs is replacing the daughters of families with his dolls. So what we're going to do now is attempt to answer a few questions, the first being how Longlegs crafts these dolls, why he uses them rather than some other device to commit his crimes, and of course, why his face looks the way it does. Now, I think there are two ways that Longlegs may have learned how to create his dolls. Either he learned how to do so from the devil himself, or he gained this knowledge from various occult texts that he studied. The devil teaching him how to do it is the simplest explanation, and it might be the correct one. However, on the Birthday Murders website, there are 5 hyperlinks at the bottom of the page that trigger downloads of 5 zip files, all of which are named with Longlegs' signature cipher. And after these names have been decoded, the names of the folders in these downloads are the following in order from first to last: 9 circles we descend, friend of a friend, planet queen, X's marks the spot, a slider, sand of the sea, Revelation 13, and bang a gong, all of which either refer to song names, Longlegs himself, his crimes, or biblical themes. And in some of those files are pages taken directly from various texts on religion, demons, magic, and the occult. In a lot of his ciphers, Longlegs seems to be taunting law enforcement with hints and messaging that could potentially clue them in on his methods and his motives. And in these files, there are also several photos of various crime scenes that seem to be placed there to accomplish the same thing. So it could be that that is all these various pages are, and that simple explanation of gaining knowledge from the devil would support this line of thinking. But we can also operate under the assumption that these are both clues meant to taunt law enforcement, and the actual way that Longlegs discovered how to create his dolls and contact Satan. Within the 5 zip files, there is a total of 24 pages included throughout these folders that have been taken from 10 separate books: Clairvoyance and Occult Powers by Swami Panchadasi, which I've already mentioned, the 3rd edition of the Golden Bow Volumes 1 and 2 by Sir James George Fraser, Luzak's Semitic Text and Translation Series Volume 14, The History of Witchcraft and Demonology by Montague Summers, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds by Charles Mackey, Dogma and Rituals of Transcendental Magic by Eliphas Levi, The Infernal Dictionary by Jacques-Colin de Plancy, Essays in Occultism, Spiritism, and Demonology by William Richard Harris, and finally, Occult Psychology by George Brown. Now, these 10 books have a few things in common, namely that they all discuss to some degree magic, witches, demons, and the occult. And while I'm sure there's a whole host of goodies on all these subjects throughout the entirety of these books, we'll only be focusing on those 20 pages and a few that surround them. Starting with the Golden Bow, we're given page 187 from the first volume from the Planet Queen folder that talks about how various island cultures of Southeast Asia would use parts of the body left over after childbirth, the placenta and the umbilical cord, as charms of great power. It also talks about how infants born with a caul, that is, a portion of the amnion that covers the fetus's head at birth, was thought to bring the gift of second sight in later years that would allow these people to see things others can't, like devils and evil spirits. Page 316 from Dogma and Rituals of Transcendental Magic, that can be found in the Revelation 13 folder, talks of a ritual that was conducted upon King Charles IX of France, where body parts were used to commune with spirits, and how making sacrifices to the devil gains his favor. Now, what stands out from these 2 pages are the usage of body parts as objects of power, and the emphasis on the most revolting sacrifices being best suited to conciliating the favor of Satan. And we'll talk about why this is important in understanding Longlegs' process in a moment, but let's first take a look at some more pages from these files. Excerpts from pages 131 to 134 from the Dogma and Rituals of Transcendental Magic from the Revelation 13 folder have the following to say about bewitchments, something that Longlegs relies on heavily in his dreaded work. Every action is subject to a judgment, and such judgment is eternal. These are dogmas and principles from which it follows that the good or evil which we will, to others as to ourselves, according to the capacity of our will, and within the sphere of our action, will infallibly take place, if the will be confirmed, and the determination fixed by acts. The act should be analogous to the will. The intent to do harm, or to excite love, in order to be efficacious, must be confirmed by deeds of hatred or affection. Whatsoever bears the impression of a human soul belongs to that soul. Whatsoever a man is appropriated after any manner becomes his body in the broader acceptation of the term. And anything which is done to the body of a man is felt, mediately or immediately, by his soul. It is for this reason that every species of hostility towards one's neighbor is regarded by moral theology as the beginning of homicide. Bewitchment is a homicide, and the more infamous because it eludes self-defense by the victim and punishment by law. This principle being established to exonerate our conscience, and for the warning of the weak vessels, let us affirm boldly that bewitchment is possible. Let us even go further and lay down that it is not only possible, but in some sense, necessary and fatal. It is continually going on in the social world, unconsciously both to agents and patients. Involuntary bewitchment is one of the most terrible dangers of human life. Passional sympathy inevitably subjects the hottest desire to the strongest will. Moral maladies are more contagious than physical, and there are some triumphs of infatuation and fashion which are comparable to leprosy or cholera. We may die of an evil acquaintance as well as of a contagious touch, and the frightful plague which, during recent centuries only, has avenged in Europe the profanation of the mysteries of love, is a revelation of the analogical laws of nature, and at the same time offers only a feeble image of the moral corruptions which follow daily on an equivocal sympathy. There is a story of a jealous and infamous man who, to avenge himself on a rival, contracted an incurable disorder and made it the common scourge and anathema of a divided bed. This atrocious history is that of every magician, or rather of every sorcerer, who practices bewitchments. He poisons himself in order that he may poison others. He damns himself that he may torture others. He draws in hell with his breath in order that he may expel it by his breath. He wounds himself to death that he may inflict death on others, but possessed of this unhappy courage, it is positive and certain that he will poison and slay by the mere projection of his perverse will. There are some forms of love which are as deadly as hatred, and the bewitchments of goodwill are the torment of the wicked. The prayers offered to God for the conversion of a man bring misfortune to that man if he will not be converted. As we have already said, it is weariness and danger to strive against the fluidic currents occasioned by the chains of wills in union. Voluntary bewitchments are still frequent in our rural places because natural forces, among ignorant and isolated persons, operate without being diminished by any doubt or any diversion. A frank, absolute hatred, unleavened by rejected passion or personal cupidity is, under certain given conditions, a death sentence for its object. I say unmixed with amorous passion or cupidity because a desire, being an attraction, counterbalances and annuls the power of projection. For example, a jealous person will never efficaciously bewitch his rival, and a greedy heir will never by the mere fact of his will succeed in shortening the days of a miserly and long-lived uncle. Bewitchments attempted under such conditions reflect upon the operator and help rather than hurt their object, setting him free from a hostile action which destroys itself by excessive exaggeration. The term enfoutement, bewitchment, so strong in its Gaelic simplicity, admirably expresses what it means: the act of enveloping someone, so to speak, in a formulated will. The instrument of bewitchments is the great magic agent which, under the influence of an evil will, becomes really and positively the demon. Witchcraft, properly so called, that is, ceremonial operation with intent to bewitch, acts only on the operator and serves to fix and confirm his will, by formulating it with persistence and labor, the two conditions which make volition efficacious. The more difficult or horrible the operation, the greater is its power, because it acts more strongly on the imagination and confirms effort and direct ratio of resistance. This explains the bizarre nature and even atrocious character of the operations in black magic, as practiced by the ancients and in the Middle Ages. The diabolical masses, administration of sacraments to reptiles, effusions of blood, human sacrifices, and other monstrosities, which are the very essence and reality of Goetia, or black magic. Such are the practices which from all time have brought down upon sorcerers the just repression of the laws. Black magic is really only a graduated combination of sacrileges and murders that are designed for the permanent perversion of a human will and for the realization in a living man of the hideous phantom of the demon. It is therefore, properly speaking, the religion of the devil, the cultus of darkness, hatred of good carried to the height of paroxysm. It is the incarnation of death and the persistent creation of hell. Now that's quite a lot to take in, but let's break down what we've learned so far and how it applies to Longlegs and his crimes. Earlier we learned that body parts have a great power associated with them, and they're a key component of ritualistic magic. And why that matters as far as Longlegs is concerned is because of a key detail that's present in every murder he has committed: the absence of some of the body parts or blood of his victims. Within each of Longlegs' dolls lies the engine that fuels their demonic power. Small silver balls that are placed in each doll's head that serve as a sort of black magic brain and conduit for the power that enamors Longlegs' victims. I think what we're meant to gather from this information is that Longlegs is using body parts in his rituals, specifically to craft these silver orbs, as not only would that explain how he makes the orbs, which is quite the mystery otherwise, but it also potentially clues us in on why Longlegs' face looks the way that it does. If my theory is accurate, then that means that each of Longlegs' murders serves as a gathering place for the resources he needs to perform the next murder. But then how did he craft his first orb before he began murdering people? Well, it is possible that he murdered a single person in order to do so, or maybe he gathered body parts from a graveyard, morgue, or medical facility. But knowing the devil, whose contracts are often portrayed as coming with a price, perhaps when he decided to pay a visit to his potential disciple, he completed his studies of rituals by granting him the knowledge of how to craft these orbs. But for his first orb, the devil demanded that he give part of himself to his cause, and so Longlegs was commanded to use the flesh of his own face to craft his first orb, which not only sealed his pact with his new master, but allowed the devil to change his features into an unrecognizable mask that would further assist him in remaining anonymous when serving him. The information we went over about bewitchments seemed to back up this theory, as according to Eliphas Levi, bewitchments are more powerful the more revolting they are, and gathering the body parts of the people you've slain to fuel your rituals is quite revolting. And he also mentions that bewitchments are only made stronger by the sorcerer immersing themselves in their own craft. He poisons himself in order that he may poison others. He damns himself that he may torture others. He draws in hell with his breath in order that he may expel it by his breath. He wounds himself to death that he may inflict death on others. But possessed of this unhappy courage, it is positive and certain that he will poison and slay by the mere projection of his perverse will. Sounds like a pretty good reason for Longlegs to allow the devil to disfigure him in my book. But there's even more nods to this theory that were given through another book. In the slider folder, there are 2 pages taken from the history of witchcraft and demonology that have 5 numbered steps, If we look at the surrounding pages in this book, we learn that these pages are taken from the section of this book that details the steps one needs to take to become a witch and make a pact with the devil. And this book mentions that it took these steps from a book titled Compendium Maleficarum by Francesco Maria Guazzo. There are 11 steps to this process, but right now we really only need to talk about the 4th, 9th, and 10th steps that were given in these images, and the 11th step, which I think is of some importance, but isn't provided to us in these folders. Fourthly, in the hands of the devil, they vow obedience and subjection. They pay him homage and vassalage, laying their fingers on some very black book. They bind themselves never to return to the faith of Christ, to observe none of the divine precepts, to do no good work, but to obey the demon only, and attend without fail the nightly conventicles. Ninthly, they request the devil to strike them out of the book of Christ, and to inscribe them in his own. Then comes forth that very black book on which, as has been said before, they laid hands when doing homage, and they are inscribed therein with the devil's claw. Tenthly, they promise the devil sacrifices and offerings at stated times, once a fortnight, or at least each month, the murder of some child, or a homicidal act of sorcery, and other weekly misdeeds to the prejudice of mankind, such as hailstorms, tempests, fires, cattle plagues, etc. 11thly, the demon imprints upon the witches some mark. There's more to this 11th step, and we'll need to examine the second one as well. However, we won't need to examine those until later on. But I'd say that these steps all align pretty well with Longlegs' actions in person, as he's clearly a man who has succeeded in becoming a witch or a sorcerer after entering into a pact with the devil, whom he offers a bevy of profane sacrifices on a regular basis, and he even has his mark upon him, that being his ruined face. We're given more references to witches in the Planet Queen folder as well, as here we're given 4 stills taken from the Swedish film Häxan, or The Witch as it would be called in English, which is a silent film from 1922 that features 7 parts that chronicle the historical roots and superstitions surrounding witchcraft. And when we take a look at what these scenes are meant to represent, we find that they're very much in line with Longlegs' character and his actions. One image depicts a nun holding a knife who is possessed by evil spirits. Another shows a group of people standing before the devil as a witch is being mistreated for not performing enough evil deeds. This one shows a naked woman tied up, which is a reference to the Salem witch trials. And this last one shows us a scene where a woman is claiming that her husband is sick from a witch's spell. 2 of these scenes are meant to reinforce the idea that Longlegs has become a witch. One of them is a nod to the fact that the fathers of the families he targets end up murdering their families due to their possession by the machinations of the witch that is Longlegs, and the other is a reference to another person that's fallen under Longlegs' influence that dresses like a nun, Lee Harker's mother, Ruth Harker, whom we'll be talking about a little later on. Something else that draws attention to the idea that Longlegs may have undergone this change in appearance because of the devil is a detail that Hunter uncovered in his video that we can find in Longlegs' workshop. Pasted onto a window in front of his workbench is a picture of 2 intertwined snakes, and Hunter discovered that in Sumerian mythology, the twin snakes are a symbol of snake worship and the notion that snakes, due to them constantly shedding their skin, have eternal life. And considering Longlegs' appearance doesn't change at all in the span of nearly 30 years, perhaps this face is a new set of skin that was granted to him by his master and has given him eternal life. So with that, unless any of you have a better theory, or I'm proved to be wrong otherwise, I believe this info solves 2 of the film's greatest mysteries for us. While that might be the case, there's still more about how these orbs and dolls function that remain a mystery. But fortunately, I think we can discover exactly how they work by examining more of these pages. In page 148 of the Golden Bow Volume 2, we're given the following. In the opinion of the Raskolniks, a mirror is an accursed thing, invented by the devil, perhaps on account of the mirror's supposed power of drawing out the soul in the reflection, so facilitating its capture. As with shadows and reflections, so with portraits, they are often believed to contain the soul of the person portrayed. This might seem like a bit of useless information as far as Longlegs is concerned, but if portraits are paintings made in the likeness of another, wouldn't a doll made in the likeness of another be in a way a kind of portrait? While the doll's primary function seems to be its use as a conduit for the devil to possess the targeted families, so they might be slain in the most gruesome fashion, we're shown 2 instances where people's souls are captured and bound to the will of Longlegs through these dolls, those 2 being Carrie Ann Camera and our protagonist, Lee Harker. And one of the big reveals in this story is the fact that Lee has been working on Longlegs' behalf for nearly her entire life. Something that she was unaware of until she learned of her mother's involvement in his schemes, and she was confronted with her own doll at home. And the fact that she was unaware of her bewitchment is backed up by pages 132 and 133 of the Golden Bow Volume 2. If New Guinean Galelareese mariners are sailing past certain rocks, or come to a river where they never were before, they must wash their faces, for otherwise, the spirits of the rocks or the river would snatch away their souls. When a Dayak of Borneo is about to leave a forest through which he has been walking alone, he never forgets to ask the demons to give him back his soul, for it may be that some forest devil has carried it off, for the abduction of a soul may take place without its owner being aware of its loss, and it may happen either while he is awake or asleep. Now that we've reached this point, I believe it's best that we start talking about Longlegs' crimes in more detail. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, Longlegs began setting up his murders in the year 1966, and aside from the method he uses to kill these families, with each case we can find a few similarities between them. Every family that Longlegs has targeted all lived in white houses in neighborhoods or towns that reference the biblical or occult, where members of the Catholic Church had one or more members whose names correspond with the names of saints, prominent biblical figures, or the occult, and nearly all of them were murdered on dates that have some significance for various churches. The color white is used in a few different places in the film, like with Longlegs' clothing, his car, and in the snowy scene we receive at the beginning of the film when he comes to call on the Harker family. And the simplest and most likely explanation for the presence of all this white has to do with the fact that white has traditionally been seen as a symbol of purity. So Longlegs cladding himself in white is probably meant to serve as a mockery to that purity, and the white houses only enhances the fact that Longlegs is defiling good, God-fearing families in the worst ways imaginable. The biblical and occult names, the family's membership in the Catholic Church, and the dates of their murders falling on important religious holidays all accomplish much the same thing, though some of the names that we'll be discussing are more so Easter eggs than they are actually significant to his crimes, and I owe a lot of credit to Hunter for pointing some of these aspects of his crimes out for me. However, there's something interesting about his targeting of Catholic families and setting up some of his murders to fall on the feast day of saints. In the steps to become a witch that we talked about earlier from the history of witchcraft and demonology, we find that 2 of the steps to become a witch, the 2nd and the 11th, involve the Catholic faith and saints. Secondly, they abjure the Catholic faith, withdraw from the obedience to God, renounce Christ and the protection of the Most Blessed Virgin Mary, and all the sacraments of the Church. 11thly, the demon imprints upon the witches some mark. When all of this has been performed in accordance with the instructions of those masters who have initiated the novice, the latter bind themselves by fearful oaths never to worship the Blessed Sacrament, to heap curses on all saints, and especially to abjure Our Lady Immaculate, to trample underfoot and spit upon all holy images, the cross, and relics of saints. So not only is defiling the religious something that is demanded of witches by the devil, but he demands in particular the defilement of the Catholic Church and its saints, which makes sense when you consider that the Catholic Church, though technically not the first church, is often regarded as being the first church, and it is by far the largest single denomination of the Christian faith across the world. So now that we have all of this in mind, let's begin delving into the murders Longlegs has orchestrated and how they align with the parameters set forth by his master. Starting with the first family he murders, the Applewhite family, we find that their family name is one of those Easter eggs, as their name is likely a reference to Marshall Applewhite and his Heaven's Gate cult. Another Easter egg is found in the name of the sheriff of the county they lived in, Sheriff Wicker, which is likely a nod to the 1973 film The Wicker Man, or perhaps even the 2006 remake that features Nicolas Cage. The Applewhite family lived in Damascus, Oregon, which is a reference to Damascus, Syria, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world that features prominently in many biblical stories, especially one in Revelation, where Damascus was reduced to ruin. The Applewhites lived on Rhododendron Street, which is a flower that in the Dongba religion of the Naki people who reside in southwest China is thought to be the flower that guards the entrance to the underworld. The Applewhites also had a daughter named Teresa, who shared her name with one of the most famous saints of all time, Mother Teresa, making her an appropriate target for desecration. Lastly, the murders of the Applewhite family took place on July 14th, which is the feast day of Saint Kateri Tekakwitha. The second family, the Clover family, has much less going on as far as symbolism is concerned, but the 3-leaf clover is seen as a symbol of the Trinity, and their name in this symbolism is also a reference to a song that Longlegs quotes in some of his ciphers, Crimson and Clover by Tommy James and the Shondells, and the lyrics for this song are eerily applicable to Longlegs' actions. Now I don't hardly know her, but I think I could love her, Crimson and Clover. I wish we'd come walking over. Now I've been waiting to show her, Crimson and Clover, over and over. Also, the patriarch of this family was reported to have been a particularly good Catholic, and Longlegs made sure their home was plastered with as much satanic imagery as he could to mock God further. For the third family, the Pendergast family, there isn't much biblical or occult significance to their family name, outside of the possibility of their names being taken from a couple of Catholic archbishops, but the name could be a reference to the Pendergast book series that chronicles the FBI's attempts to catch a serial killer, and their daughter Louise shares the name of a saint, Saint Louis de Marillac, and the date that their murder falls on is both the date to commemorate a list of saints in the Orthodox Church and the day that the Manson family murders began. The mention of the Manson family is interesting because we also get mention of it in the film, and when you think about everything that Longlegs does, his actions are very similar to that of the Manson family and the Zodiac Killer, so a reference to them is quite poignant. The fourth family, the Wormwood family, take their name from a verse in Revelation chapter 8, verses 10 through 11. The third angel blew his trumpet, and a great star fell from heaven, blazing like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters became wormwood, and many died from the water because it was made bitter. Wormwood could also be a reference to a demon in the Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis, who is being taught by his uncle how best to tempt and damn a man, which seems fitting for Longlegs' MO. The Wormwood family lived on Marigold Drive, and the marigold flower is often associated with the Virgin Mary. The youngest daughter's name was Cynthia, who shared a name with another saint, Saint Cynthia, and the murders of this family happened to take place on Easter weekend. Here is where we first receive mention of the car that Longlegs drives, which is a Chevy Nomad, and while the word nomad in English is often used to denote a person who travels from place to place, a nomad in shamanism is a person who believes that physical objects or things have souls, which is even more fitting. The fifth family, the Hesse family, features another Easter egg, this time being the father's name, Eldritch, which is a word that means strange and frightening, but one that is more often associated with the cosmic horrors of H.P. Lovecraft and all who drew inspiration from him. But the Hesses share their name with the town of Hesse, Germany, and also Hermann Hesse. In Hesse, Germany, there is a megalith called the Wotanstein that is associated with a Christian legend. According to the legend, the devil threw down this stone upon the first Christian church in Fritzlar that was built by St. Boniface to destroy it, and the marks and scratches on this stone are said to have been marks left by the devil's claws, and associating this legend with Longlegs' actions is only too fitting. Hermann Hesse was a renowned German-Swiss poet, novelist, and painter who wrote a book called Demian, which chronicles the story of a young boy struggling with his identity who is living in two worlds at once, which could be a nod to Longlegs' own struggle with his identity when he was younger. Demian also features the god Abraxas as a symbol many times in the story, and as we learned with the recent release of Late Night with the Devil, Abraxas can be seen as a halfway malevolent entity that is above even the Judeo-Christian God and the devil. The Hesse's daughter's name was Mary, which is an obvious nod to the Virgin Mary, and Longlegs, or the devil, also made sure that the family's parakeet was murdered as well, as Jesus had a pet parakeet. The date they were murdered was the date that Pope Gregory died in 624, and Pope Urban was elected in 1088, and there was a lot of upside-down triangles placed about their home, a symbol that represents the unholy trinity of Satan, the Antichrist, and the false prophet, something that is quite important to Longlegs' work that we'll be talking about a little later on. The sixth family, the Engstrom family, features another Easter egg in the form of Lonnie Lamb Elementary School, as Lonnie Lamb is a character in the Halloween series of films. The family seemed to have lived in Salem, Oregon, as the family's patriarch Warren worked at the Salem Municipal Courthouse, which is a reference to the Salem witch trials. The family's murders occurred on November 17th, which is the feast day for St. Elizabeth of Hungary, and their daughter's name was Polly, which interestingly enough, is a nickname for Mary. The seventh family was the Ware family, whose murders were discovered by the Hemlock Police Department, and hemlock is a plant that is said to have become poisonous after Jesus' blood touched it. The family lived on Grimaldi Way, which is a reference to the Jesuit priest Francesco Maria Grimaldi, and the neighborhood they lived in was the Mount Golgotha neighborhood, which is the name of the mountain where the crucifixion of Jesus took place. Their eldest daughter's name was Veronica, who shares her name with a saint, and their youngest was named Rosemary, and rosemary is said to have been the favorite plant of the Virgin Mary. Their mother was stabbed 66 times, one off from 666. The eighth family isn't listed on the website, but that family was the Camera family, who were murdered along with a priest that came to visit the home in June of 1975. But their murder is something we'll need to discuss more when we start talking about Longlegs' accomplices. After the Camera family, Longlegs wouldn't murder again for 12 years, when the Bannister family were slain in October of 1987. The Bannisters lived in the town of Crowley, which is a reference to the occult mystic Aleister Crowley, and the county this town is in is Malheur County, which means misfortune in French. The mother's name was Frances, which is likely a nod to St. Francis of Assisi. The daughter's name was Veronica, which as we learned earlier, is a name shared with a saint, and Veronica attended Fulsidae Elementary, and Fulsidae is the family of spiders that the Daddy Longlegs hails from. Also, the family service took place at Bolin and Reed Funeral Home, with the name Bolin of course being a reference to Mark Bolin of T-Rex. The 10th family was the Gaddis family. They lived on Chauncey Street, a name which could have been taken from Charles or Maurice Chauncey, with Charles being an American clergyman in the 18th century, and Maurice being a 16th century Catholic priest and Carthusian monk. The neighborhood they lived in is called Abaddon Hills, and Abaddon in the Torah is a word that's used to refer to a bottomless pit that often appears alongside Sheol, the resting place of the dead. Abaddon in the Book of Revelation is also an angel that is described as being the king of an army of locusts. The mother's name was Ramona, which could be a reference to Ramona Fossas Romans, a nun who was murdered during the religious persecution in Spain between 1934 and 1937, and their daughter's name was Valerie, who shared a name with Saint Valerie of Limoges. The family service took place at the Shondell Family Funeral Home, which is a nod to Tommy James and the Shondells and their Crimson and Clover song that we talked about earlier. The Horn family was the 11th family, and their name might just be a nod to the devil's horns, but their daughters are named Mary, another Mother Mary reference, and Kathleen, which is a derivative of Catherine that means either pure or virgin, and the mother's name was Teresa, yet another nod to Mother Teresa. And it's explained on the website that Teresa was a particularly devout Catholic, and in an Instagram teaser about the Horn family, the caption reads that Mother got it worst, Father said she needed it most. The only other detail here though is that the priest who officiated their funeral ceremony was named Balthazar Thorn, with Balthazar being one of the 3 wise men, and Thorn being a possible nod to Damien Thorn of the Omen series. The 12th and final family isn't listed on the Birthday Murders website, rather they appear only in the film, but we aren't given any other info on them. The final family ends up being the Carter family, and while we'll have a bit more to say about them towards the end of this video, there are only 3 potential links to Longlegs that were given with their names. Their daughter's name is Ruby, and rubies are mentioned at various points in the Bible. Her mother's name is Anna, which could be referring to Anna the prophetess, an elderly woman that's featured in the Gospel of Luke, who is said to have prophesied about Jesus at the Temple of Jerusalem. But that third link, I'd like to save for later. Now, aside from all the similarities between these crimes that we've already discussed, there's one interesting detail that's present in all of them that was a bit difficult to discern the meaning of: the presence of a red toy piano at each of these homes. Longlegs has the dolls delivered to the house by people posing as members of the church, so it's possible that he also has these pianos delivered in the same way. It could be that the red pianos are just a nod to the frequent theme of crimson or red that we find throughout the film, but Hunter pointed me towards a Russian urban legend that involves red pianos. Supposedly there was a time during the Soviet era where red pianos were sold in retail environments, but these red pianos weren't ordinary pianos. The pianos came with the phone number of a person who was the only person who could repair the piano in the event that it stopped working, and this piano was designed to stop working at a certain point, as each key of this piano featured small needles that were attached to tubes that fed into a device that collected the player's blood. Once the blood filled up the container, a mechanism was released that prevented the piano from being played, which then necessitated a call to that repair person. The repair person, who was described as being an old woman, would then come and service the piano, stipulating that they be left alone and unwatched while they did so. And after she left, the process would repeat so long as the piano kept being played. Aside from how sinister this story is, 2 things in particular stand out as far as Longlegs is concerned: the collection of blood, and the fact that the repair person was an old woman. In this story, the pianos seem to have been full-sized, but because Longlegs made sure his pianos were toy pianos, he ensured they be played by the children of the family. And as we discussed earlier, it's highly probable that Longlegs is using body parts and blood that he takes from these crime scenes so he can make his orbs. So perhaps these pianos were meant to serve as another resource that he could use to acquire blood from these little girls. The other thing that relates to him in this story is obvious, that being the fact that an old woman was the one who repaired these pianos, as Longlegs has the appearance of an old woman. This is an interesting little detail, and this story seems to fit well with the themes of the film, but if any of you have any other ideas on what this could mean, please let us know down below. So that's 13 families that were possessed and viciously eradicated by the dark sorcery of Longlegs and his master, all of whom were murdered because they had some degree of symbolism related to his MO. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about all of these crimes is that Longlegs leaves absolutely no trace of physical evidence at these crime scenes, and that has to do with something that I've mentioned a few times already, but have waited to talk about up until this point: his accomplices. Now, one thing you might have been wondering whenever I mentioned them is the fact that I've been saying accomplices rather than accomplice, because as far as the film goes, we're only shown one accomplice, Ruth Harker, Lee Harker's mom. But the thing is, Longlegs didn't recruit her until he had already committed 6 of these murders, so that means he was either delivering these dolls to these families' homes himself, or he had another accomplice. It's possible that he was doing it himself by leaving the dolls at their front doors with a note attached to it, as I doubt that anyone would be willing to personally take a doll from such a hideous individual without being suspicious, nor would Longlegs want to expose himself to any unwanted attention from his victims. And that's what leads me to believe that he had another accomplice before Ruth signed up to his cause. What makes this all the more plausible is the fact that whoever runs the Birthday Murders website seems to be an accomplice of his as well, perhaps the same accomplice that's been working with him since the beginning. We know this because after the final update was made to the website on July 15th, the person running the website had this to say when they were asked about their identity: "I'm just a friend of a friend of a friend, and this friend wants me to stay." So who could this person be? Well, considering they had access to all of Longlegs' more personal effects in the files they provided, as well as many different crime scene photos, I'd hazard a guess and say that they're some sort of law enforcement official. And as it turns out, we might know who that individual is. On the IMDb page for the Longlegs film, there's a background character listed by the name of Agent Kurt Cobble. That's Cobble with a K, and Longlegs' name is Dale Ferdinand Cobble, spelled with a C. This could be just a coincidence, or like every other detail strewn throughout this film, it probably isn't. Perhaps Kurt is a brother or cousin of Longlegs, and maybe he was a part of Longlegs' band back in the day and followed his family member down his rabbit hole into the occult. Knowing that they'd need a little bit of official help to carry out their crimes, Kurt decided to pursue a career in the FBI to better assist Longlegs. And just as an added layer of protection, he changed the C in their surname to a K to avoid any background checks coming up with his brother's name. So I think that this man dressed up as a priest and filled Ruth's role until she was recruited, perhaps delivering both the piano and the doll at this time, but later changing his role to just the delivery of the pianos while he worked on Longlegs' behalf behind the scenes to gather information for him and draw his fellow agents away from any potential evidence that might clue them into what exactly is going on with these crimes. So aside from what occurs during the events of the film, we now have a pretty fantastic handle on who Longlegs is, how he became who he is, what he does to commit his various crimes, and why he targets the people that he's targeted. But we still don't have the full picture just yet, because now we need to answer one very important question. Why is Longlegs doing all of this? Well, to answer that, we need to discuss the final aspect present in many of his clues and ciphers that we haven't discussed yet, verses from the Bible. Throughout the folders were given on the website, the Instagram teasers, and the trailers were given snippets of 2 chapters in particular, Revelation 12 and 13, both of which I'll read for you now. The Woman and the Dragon. And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads 7 diadems. His tail swept down 1/3 of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. She gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was caught up to God and to his throne, and the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. Satan thrown down to earth. Now war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God, and the authority of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. And they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb, and by the word of their testimony, for they loved not their lives even unto death. Rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows that his time is short. And when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. But the woman was given the 2 wings of the great eagle, so that she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness, to the place where she is to be nourished for a time, and times, and half a time. The serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth after the woman, to sweep her away with a flood. But the earth came to the help of the woman, and the earth opened its mouth, and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured from his mouth. Then the dragon became furious with the woman, and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring, on those who keep the commandments of God, and hold to the testimony of Jesus. And he stood on the sand of the sea. The first beast. And I saw a beast rising out of the sea, with 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems on its horns, and blasphemous names on its heads. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard, its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. And to it the dragon gave his power, and his throne, and great authority. One of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed, and the whole earth marveled as they followed the beast. And they worshipped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast. And they worshipped the beast, saying, Who is like the beast, and who can fight against it? And the beast was given a mouth uttering haughty and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. It opened its mouth to utter blasphemies against God, blaspheming his name and his dwelling, that is, those who dwell in heaven. Also, it was allowed to make war on the saints, and authority was given it over every tribe, and people, and language, and nation. And all who dwell on earth will worship it, everyone whose name has not been written before the foundation of the world, in the book of life, of the Lamb who was slain. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. If anyone is to be taken captive, to captivity he goes. If anyone is to be slain with the sword must he be slain. Here is a call for the endurance and faith of the saints. The second beast. Then I saw another beast rising out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon, and makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose mortal wound was healed. It performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in front of people. And by the signs that it is allowed to work in the presence of the beast, it deceives those who dwell on earth, telling them to make an image for the beast that was wounded by the sword, and yet lived. and it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast might even speak, and might cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be slain. Also, it causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be marked on their right hand or the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark, that is the name of the beast, or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. As I mentioned before I read these chapters, several of Longlegs' ciphers and clues make reference to these two chapters, and what these two chapters are talking about is the advent of the Antichrist, which is what I believe Longlegs' true goal with all these murders is. The first chapter about the woman and the dragon describes the devil's attempts to devour the child birthed by a heavenly woman, only to be thrown out of heaven down to the earth. And in Catholic theology, which we're going to go with considering the heavy emphasis on Catholics in this story, the woman is supposed to represent the Virgin Mary, and the child is Jesus. Longlegs' inclusion of this chapter in some of his clues is likely supposed to just be references to the fact that he's operating according to the will of Satan. But chapter 13 is all about the Antichrist, and the meaning of its inclusion in this story requires a little more investigative work to uncover. When Longlegs is captured by the authorities, and Lee speaks with him in an interrogation room, he says the following to her. There she is, the almost birthday girl. It's funny, the day you decided to go into law enforcement, you were 20. We had such a big laugh about it, although it was only me who laughed. Who is this she you're talking about? The seventh she, who is to be given the same choice they've all been given. Crimson or clover. Accept the gift and destroy it, and destroy yourself and yourselves, or keep it and bow down. Bow all the way down and get right down to the dirty, dirty work. Work that gets dirty as it cleans, like a mop, like a rag. But you don't work alone, do you? Someone's been helping you, an accomplice. So the seventh she that Longlegs is referring to here is Ruth Harker, and why he calls her the seventh she is because the Harker household was the seventh family visited by Longlegs, but they weren't the seventh family to be slain. That honor went to the Ware family later that year in August. But there's more to calling Ruth the seventh she than just the order in which Longlegs met her. In this story, though the devil takes much of the credit for giving Longlegs his power and possessing these families, it's not just the devil who assists Longlegs with their plans, but a demon as well. Pages 9, 109, and 110 that were taken from essays in occultism, spiritism, and demonology that are found in the Bangagong folder set the stage for us in this regard. According to Revelation, we are surrounded by beings of a supernatural or preternatural order. We are told of the prince of the power of the air, of principalities and powers in high places, that is, in the air above us. We are warned that our wrestling is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world. That is to say, against Satan and his rebel spirits, who are in conspiracy to ruin the human race and to frustrate the purposes of God towards mankind. No mind which accepts the inspiration of the Bible may deny the existence and malign influence on human beings of these rebel angels. The historic Catholic Church teaches now, and for 2,000 years has uniformly taught, the existence of Satan, of lost spirits, their unquenchable hatred for the human race, and their sinister influence upon persons who abandon themselves to intercourse with them. If there be no devil or evil spirits, what is the meaning of the exorcisms and baptism, of the appeals to God in the Church's missal, ritual, and public prayers, to save us from the evil influence and enmity of Satan and the angels who sinned? If there be no Satan and no evil spirits, there can be no Savior, for from what are we rescued? And if there be no Savior and no Redeemer, can there be Christianity? Now why did Jesus Christ, the Son of God, our Redeemer and Savior, become man? St. John removes all doubt from our minds when, in language emphatic and convincing, he tells us in his first epistle, the Son of God appeared on earth, that he might destroy the works of the devil. The devil, as singularly as he's often been held responsible for demonic occurrences in our world, has never been alone. Gods and demons that were worshipped by cultures past have since been recognized by the Church as always being lieutenants of the true master of evil, who have worked on his behalf since his fall from grace. And in this story, there is one in particular that seems to be aiding in their work, Lamashtu. Credits to Hunter for pointing me towards much of the information I'm about to discuss, but Lamashtu is an ancient evil spirit that was prominent in the pantheons of Sumeria and Akkad, and this description from Wikipedia describes her role in the world quite well. She bore 7 names and was described as 7 witches in incantations. Her evil deeds included, but were not limited to, slaying children, unborns, and infants, causing harm to mothers and expectant mothers, eating men and drinking their blood, disturbing sleep, bringing nightmares, killing foliage, infesting rivers and lakes, and being a bringer of disease, sickness, and death. Now, the reason Hunter concluded that Lamashtu is involved in this story are the many references made in promotional material and files to a daughter of the seventh She and the seven evil spirits of ancient Mesopotamia. Lee is indeed the daughter of a seventh She, as she is the daughter of Ruth Harker. And further proof for this notion can be found in the idea that seven daughters are said to be born with powers of clairvoyance, which Lee is given after she's possessed by the devil. And I believe that Ruth was also being partially possessed by another She associated with the number 7, Lamashtu. I think it makes a lot of sense that a demon whose primary function is the murder of children and women, and thus the disruption of families, is the entity Longlegs and the devil had possessed Ruth. As though we see that Ruth willingly entered into a pact with Longlegs to protect her daughter from harm, we see at various points that Ruth is rather lethargic and absent-minded, which could be attributed to the fact that she spent a number of years living with the devil and his sharpest instrument, whilst witnessing immense horror. But it could also mean that she's not all there because there is another entity sharing her body with her. Another reference to Ruth's possible possession can be found in page 39 of Luzak's Semitic text that we receive in the Planet Queen folder. Here is described an entity known as the Ardat Lily, which is a restless ghost who has no husband that wanders up and down, forced by her desire to roam abroad, unable to rest quietly until she is satisfied. She is probably the entity who gives birth to the Alu, or devil half-human, half-specter. As we know, Ruth and Lee lived alone in a rural setting, and considering Longlegs specifically targets Catholics, perhaps Ruth comes from a family of hardline Catholics, and she had her daughter out of wedlock, causing her family to shun her, which is why Ruth mentions at points in the film that her and Lee were always alone, and no family or friends ever came to visit them, save for the doll maker, of course. So I think the devil, who seems to be the one cluing Longlegs in on which families to target, considering he states that the camera family was targeted on orders from the man downstairs in his conversation with Lee, told Longlegs to go to the Harkers because Ruth fit the description of the Ardat Lily, a fitting host for the spirit of Lamashtu, who could then wander up and down to the various crime scenes to carry out the devil's work. Interestingly enough, there are 2 more demons that are mentioned in some of these teasers and files, and Longlegs mentioning them in his ciphers and clues seem to actually contradict his goals, those 2 being Hanbi and Pazuzu. Not too much is known about Hanbi outside of his role as Pazuzu's father, but Pazuzu in particular is an evil entity, though he's also considered to be benevolent as well, as charms made in the likeness of Pazuzu were used as wards to Lamashtu. Now, why would Longlegs point authorities towards both Pazuzu and Lamashtu if Lamashtu is in league with him and Pazuzu is opposed to Lamashtu? Well, because like some other serial killers, Longlegs is fond of taunting the authorities and making his crimes into a game of sorts with his ciphers, the clues he's had his accomplices leave at crime scenes, and the files provided to us on the Birthday Murders website. In this instance, he actually includes an image of a charm depicting Pazuzu that would be used to ward off Lamashtu, and he also includes pages from Luzak's Semitic text that describe an invocation and an incantation that are meant to ward off the evil spirits of the ancients. Now, why Longlegs chose to do this is simple, because there are few law enforcement officials who are actually going to take any of the mystical elements of his crime seriously, and I imagine Longlegs put these clues out there just to say, here it is, the solution is right in front of your face, but you're too close-minded to see the truth. Now, after Longlegs has taken hold of Ruth and Lee, he begins living in their home, unbeknownst to Lee, and in a way, Longlegs, as well as the devil he serves, seems to be the father that Lee has never had, and some evidence for this notion can possibly be found in the name Longlegs, which has been all but confirmed to be a reference to Daddy Longlegs. And with Daddy Longlegs at the head of the Harker household, we find ourselves presented with yet another unholy trinity that only bolsters the chances of his work succeeding. So for 20 long years, Ruth keeps this secret from her daughter, hiding the fact that she is serving the devil alongside her daughter's new pseudo-father figure, her life reduced to shambles as her home is transformed from cleanliness and order into disrepair and chaos, reflecting her mental state and the terror that she lives with every day, with the only solace in her world being that she is protecting her daughter, which has driven her to keep every memento that reminds her of Lee, down to every baby tooth she's ever lost. But aside from furthering the plot of this film, the theme of the mother keeping a secret from her daughter is actually personally important to the director of this film, Osgood Perkins. Osgood is the son of Anthony Perkins, the man whose main claim to fame was his portrayal of Norman Bates in the Psycho series of films. But Anthony Perkins was actually gay, and Osgood's mother, Barry Berenson, helped to keep this secret for him, even from his own children, only revealing the truth after his tragic death from AIDS-related causes. Longlegs saying in one of his ciphers that he wouldn't even hurt a fly might even be a reference to the final scene of Psycho, where Norman, who has now become completely his alternate mother persona, says to himself that he wouldn't even hurt the fly that's landed on him, so he could prove to the authorities that he was a harmless old woman who would never even hurt a fly. This obviously has nothing to do with the story of this film, but it is an interesting little fact that I thought I'd share with all of you now that we've reached this point in the video. So Longlegs has great help in conducting his work from his accomplices, and again, that work is the advent of the Antichrist. But if Longlegs is trying to bring about the emergence of the Antichrist, who is that Antichrist? Initially, I thought that the Antichrist was Lee, but after all we've learned, I think that the Antichrist is actually Longlegs himself. In Revelation chapter 13, the Hydra that comes up out of the sea is supposed to represent the Antichrist, and after he emerges, a second beast emerges that is supposed to represent the false prophet that will spread the devil's and the Antichrist message across the earth. Because the Antichrist is the first beast, that 10-headed Hydra, that obviously means that they must be the first to emerge, with the prophet coming second. Not only is Longlegs heavily invested in what the devil's plans are for him, but one of our central themes for this film, the song Get It On by T-Rex, features the lyrics, "You've got the teeth of the Hydra upon you. You're dirty, sweet, and you're my girl." Dirty and Sweet are used as titles for teasers and trailers, and they're also featured in the final folder of the Birthday Murders website when the number cipher for each image is solved. Another of his ciphers says the following: "Making the misfit list, all hail the Prince of Darkness, the great and ancient serpent, only one head on the Hydra, it's time to cut the cakes." What I believe this running theme is meant to signify for us is that Longlegs is that Hydra with one head, and that Lee is his girl that he's sunk his teeth into. So does that mean that Lee is the second beast, the prophesied false prophet? Yes, I believe it does. Every aspect of Longlegs' crimes has been leading up to the point where he's discovered by Lee. The murders whose dates when applied to a calendar form an unholy trinity, with the deaths of 13 families, another number commonly associated with the devil, crafting that triangle. The clues left by Longlegs that Lee is examining in a room towards the beginning of the film are arranged in the shape of an eye, with Lee at the center of this eye as its pupil, and pupil in Latin means little doll. Carrie Ann Camera, who survived the murder of her family, lay dormant in a psychiatric facility until her doll was unearthed by Lee and her boss, so she could be used as a device to further Lee's journey towards finding Longlegs. All of this culminates with Longlegs taking his own life, Ruth undoing the hold that Satan had on Lee by blowing the head off her doll, and then finally, the showdown with Lee and her mother at her boss Carter's home at the end of the film. All this murder, all this black magic and defilement of human life has led to this moment, and here we discover something peculiar once Lee calls Ruth mom, that her mom is revolted by that label because she isn't her mother anymore. When Longlegs is speaking with Lee in that interrogation room, Longlegs says the following when Lee remarks that his work is over. "Yes, I am done, but I won't only be in here. I'll be a little bit of everywhere, waiting, in the wigs, in the father's wigs. Well, I'll let you get started now." After this exchange, Longlegs takes his life, but as he claims, he's far from being gone. I believe that when Longlegs died, he transferred his spirit into Lee's mother to oversee the death of the final family to complete his unholy trinity. And once that's nearly complete and Lee takes his life, he dies once again. But once again, that isn't his end. The final scene of the film shows Lee staring at Ruby's doll, slowly ramping up as a scene of Longlegs laughing interrupts her solemn gaze, as everything she's experienced runs through her head. As the music plays, Longlegs begins singing Happy Birthday to Lee, before the film ends with Longlegs saying Hail Satan and blowing a kiss at the camera. And now that all that he has set out to do has been completed, I think the only logical place for the spirit of Longlegs to be now is within Lee Harker. One detail in this film that I've saved for this moment is the focus that's put on two different presidential portraits at various points in this film. Those being the portrait of President Bill Clinton that hangs in Carter's office, and a portrait of President Richard Nixon that was hanging in the Camera family home. If this were any other film, these might be insignificant little details that were meant to set the mood for a scene. But in this film, no little detail should be discounted. Another detail, that being the link that the Carter family has to Longlegs, that I said that I'd save for later, is the fact that the Carter family share their name with a former president, President Jimmy Carter, who is also well known for being quite the pious individual. So what do these presidential references mean? Well, it's always been said that the Antichrist is going to emerge as a great social or political leader. Now, I said earlier that I believe that Longlegs is the Antichrist, but he's far and away from being a social or political leader. But you know who would make for a great political leader? A seasoned FBI agent who helped to take down a notorious and perverse serial killer. That's right, I believe that Lee Harker, with the spirit of the Antichrist residing within her, is the false prophet who, with his guidance, will fulfill the role of both as she goes on to enter into a political career that will lead her to becoming the President of the United States, the most powerful political leader in the entire world, who can then usher in the end times. But something I didn't consider until recording this video was that perhaps Lee is just the Antichrist, and that Ruby, the only survivor of these murders, whose doll is still left intact at the end of the film, could be the false prophet, who later in life will go on to help her savior become what she was made to be. In Lee's bedroom back at her mother's home, there was a school project left out that showed the metamorphosis of a butterfly, and on this day, Lee's birthday, the birthday that she shares with Ruby, Lee undergoes the final stage of her metamorphosis, finally maturing out of the cocoon that Longlegs had placed her in. Some dark acts are just that, acts taken out by depraved individuals who are looking to service their own desire for havoc, mayhem, and death. But other dark acts are done with purpose, with dread intent, and I think with everything we've learned about Longlegs and his actions in this film, everything he accomplished is nothing short of the culmination of a plan that's been in place for thousands of years. And now that Longlegs has transferred himself into Lee with the help of his master, the pact is complete, and the devil will have his day. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on Longlegs? Let me know down below, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured while you're at it. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up button, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, my patrons, and anyone who's decided to honor me with a super thank, and a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server and subreddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.